Hello and welcome to our Liberty Alert Live. I'm Dr. Gregory Seltz, and this is the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C. We're so happy and glad that you're with us again today. We're going to be talking about a subject that is near and dear to our culture: defund, defend. What's the government's main role, main job in our lives, especially when we're talking about policing and things like that? And how does a two-kingdom way of engaging this, how does that really talk differently than a lot of what you're hearing out there in the news? And so we're going to get to that in just a minute. Sorry, again, a little disheveled today. We just had big protests outside. I was trying to get some video of that, but our phones just are giving us all kinds of problems, our video stuff. But we had a big protest out here on the streets outside of my office here in D.C., and it was against Mitch McConnell, and they had bans and all kinds of things. But it was interesting. And I was listening again. I'm listening to what they're talking about. The biggest beef I have with a lot of this stuff is a lot of the solutions that I keep hearing are part of the problem, and they have created an even worse problem. And yet the people that are speaking the loudest are still kind of propagating these kinds of notions. And so today there are two words that are going to pop out. And by the way, and the last people that are going to solve this problem are going to be politicians. But there are two words we're going to get to today: honor and limit. Honor and limit. And that's what we're going to talk about, because I think that's the healthy way of moving forward on a lot of these very, very divisive cultural issues. So again, what are the underlying issues? What should we expect from law enforcement and government in general? And why is it essential to be honoring people, even as we talk about limiting the role of government and police in our lives as well? And then how are we going to reestablish some of these things in the midst of the chaos of today? First of all, before we get going, I just wanted to say thank you to some of you are sending me some very good emails. And one, I just want April, I got a great email from April in Yuma, Arizona, and she was talking about the Equality Act and what could be coming from the government's kind of crackdown on the church. If you think that the COVID-19 mask issues have been punitive to the church, wait till you see what the Equality Act and kind of the expansion of the sexual orientation, gender identity protections, wait till you see what that's going to do in wreaking havoc on the church. And isn't it interesting how they call it the Equality Act? Really, you know, the euphemisms abound here on the Hill. What that actually is going to do is subjugate the church and subjugate the moral teachings of the church in our culture. That's what it really should be called. And so when we're going to get to those things, isn't it amazing that no matter we do all these, we have certain victories and some of the things that happen, and we're very thankful. And then right around the corner, or even while we're dealing with some of the victories or in rejoicing the victories, there's another challenge to our religious liberty. And each one seems to me even more destructive than the one before. So we will be talking about the Equality Act. Just not today, because we really do need to deal with this issue, I think, at least to give ourselves perspective so that we can move forward and be a positive voice in the culture. Before we get started, a biblical blessing. We always have to make sure we check ourselves and say, let's make sure we understand what we're involved with. We're not afraid of any of the challenges that are before us. We're not afraid of the cultural challenges that are coming our way. We want to be a useful voice, to God and to our culture. And so, Psalm 125, I just got this. This is my devotional verse today. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken, but endures forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people both now, listen to this, both now and forever. And so the protections that we have, the world cannot take anything away from us as God's people. The victory is over. It's finished. The battle's over. The victory is won. Faith in Christ, serving families, serving others in his name, that's what life is all about. And that can never be taken away from us. Whether it's crazy mobs or the brutal issues that happen sometimes with these police guys, none of that can ever be taken away from us, even by bad government. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight for better government. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for the principles that will make our society more civil or our neighborhoods more safe. So we're privileged to engage the culture in which we live. But this is a sinful culture. It is passing away. And earth is, it's the big game until the victory is fully realized in our lives. So that's why we engage in these issues. That's why we get involved in these public issues, because we do believe that we have a role to play in the civilizing of our culture, maintaining peace and temporal justice. But we never let that issue be mistaken for our ultimate work of sharing the good news of the gospel. And that's one of the reasons why Christians always get kind of beat up in the public realm, in the policy realm, because we know it's not the ultimate work of God. The people that we're fighting against, and there is a fight going on, a cultural war, if you will, that is their only solution to everything. Politics is the solution. They, as well as we, will be disappointed by that way of thinking. But for us, we battle this. We vote in November, and then we try to go back to our lives. And more, it seems like everything is becoming politicized. And I think that's another thing. If we could start to find other public ways of caring for each other besides going to government, if we would expect more out of ourselves in our communities, in our neighborhoods, rather than always be dependent on someone else, that would go a long way in solving a lot of these issues too. Week in review, there's a couple things that just popped out. One was good news. I was a runner back in the day. At one time, I had a scholarship offer to go to Kansas to be a runner. Those of you who know my history know that I'm a runner that does it begrudgingly. I never really liked it, but I guess I was pretty decent at it. I always thought of it as just getting in shape for basketball and getting in shape for the sports I love to play. But Jim Ryan was a big Kansas icon. He was a big American icon, and he's getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom this week, or I think this month. And it just brought me back to my high school days. And he was such. He broke the 4-minute mile as a high schooler. And then, like some of the great runners, things just didn't always work out well for him in the Olympics, and it's a once every 4 years thing. But it was so amazing. He said, "I'm just so honored that anyone would think about honoring me." Wow. we need a lot more of that in our culture today too, don't we? I'm not going to deal with this today, but the Smithsonian had a thing on whiteness. It was just an offense to reason. And it shows how this discussion is so nebulous. What are you talking about? Like I said before, a lot of what we would call white supremacy today was a secular movement about 150 years ago, and there was a white face to it. I'm not, that's historical. But now it has a multicultural face, but it's still just as secular as it was before. Planned Parenthood is finally distancing itself from Margaret Sanger. But they're not distancing themselves from Margaret Sanger's policies or her view of things. They still don't have any problem executing children and selling their baby parts. And that is all in the name of the master race and becoming, survival of the fittest kind of stuff. That's the stuff we're at war with. We're at war with the ideology. Now that it has a different face on it, people are fighting white supremacy, and they're actually letting the philosophy that undergirded it, that secular supremacy that undergirding it, that's still being taught to your children. It's still being taught in school from grade school all the way through university. So again, we'll deal with that post that they had, because it was just crazy with some of the stuff they said. Like, politeness was a white supremacist idea, and like, rationality is you're just going, what is this definition? And they were embarrassed by it, and they took it down, but nonetheless, it was there for all to see, and it's undergirding some of the ways of addressing a lot of these issues. We're not going to talk about that as much today, but if you've seen that, we will get to it. And then finally, there was an educational issue, and we're not going to talk about this today, but man, I wish we could. There's a big thing now that's going on where the parents want to bring their kids back to school. Doctors, they did an interview with a bunch of doctors. I think it was on CNN or NBC, and they asked them, would you send your kids to school? And they said, of course we would, because they're not really a population that's at risk, and we're not a population at risk, and they need to be back in school. Well, that's not what the news people wanted to hear. And of course, out in California, the teachers union now is suing to keep the schools closed. So the parents want to do it, the children want to go back to school, and the teachers themselves have decided no. Now think about this for just a minute. In any other business, and they're getting full pay to do, to be at home. In any other business, if your customers came to the business and said, we'd like to eat here, and they said, no, but leave us the money for dinner and then you can go on your way. Well, that's kind of the challenge out there. And now they're pitting, this teachers versus government, or teachers versus parents, or teachers versus the crisis, when it really should be, what does the parent want to do for their children, and are there schools that will be open to providing those kinds of things? If they're, again, holding our children hostage and still demanding our money, it's an offense to reason. Parental choice is the only way we're going to get past a lot of this stuff. Because if there are teachers who want to teach right now, they're not being allowed to. The unions are using this stuff as a political ploy, and there's no way we're going to outlast the unions when they have all the money, they have our money beforehand. It would just be great if the parents could say, well, I'm going to take my money and go to this school, and that way my child can go back to school. All right, so again, defund, defend, what's the government's role in our lives? What's their job in our lives anyway? What are the underlying issues to this? And I think that's one of the big problems right now, because simplistic sloganeering is not going to solve the solution, is not going to provide solutions to a very complex problem. In fact, the defund the police movement, it defies very basic things, and in the long run, it's going to get more people killed. It already is happening. It's happening in all the major cities. It's called the Ferguson effect. And by the way, Ferguson was a lie. It was not what it was purported to be. And I have researched that thing 1,000%. And again, when we start to look at those kinds of things, the question is, what did it actually do to poor people? What did it do to those neighborhoods that needed protection from gangs, or protection from strong-arm thugs in the neighborhood who wanted to raise their family in peace? What did it actually do to those neighborhoods? And the answer is something you're not going to want to hear, because it actually made them more violent and more prone to the violence that they don't deserve. Okay, and that's kind of, again, what we're talking about, these simplistic sloganeering. When you let criminals know that there are no consequences for criminality, you're going to get more criminality. And law-abiding citizens, I don't care if they're poor, in the neighborhoods that we've served over the years in urban neighborhoods, they deserve the ability to raise their families and to raise and to be at peace in their neighborhoods. And there was an article called "The Myth of Systemic Police Racism and the Targeting That's Happening with Cops," and it was written by a policeman, and he was talking about the statistics, and he was not disagreeing with what happened to the police, with George Floyd. He said that was, again, those were rogue cops, and that was bad policing, and it should never have been done. But then it started talking about the actual statistics, what the violence that we're dealing with, and a lot of you know all about these things. But since we've done this defunding and police morale is down, murder rates and shooting rates are way up in major places. And you start to say, and it's becoming again more egregious, because the people who are bad folks, once they realize they're not going to be stopped, and then if the police do arrest them, they're also finding out that they're not going to be prosecuted a lot of times in some of these major cities. Well, all that does is make people, poor, rich, middle, all that does is make law-abiding citizens more afraid and more at risk, and that is what is happening. So this guy talked about the work that he did in Chicago for all of his life, and he said we used to walk the beat, and he said there were two things that he remembers that made such a huge difference in his life. And he said whenever we went back to the really tough neighborhoods and we used to walk those neighborhoods, he said one day was specifically, it was so amazing. So we walked, and a lot of the women of the house came out and started to clap and say thank you for coming. And we need more of that. And that was, again, what was happening even in that policeman that was part of the Ferguson thing. That guy was well respected in the neighborhood. That guy actually walked the beat. He actually was well respected by the black community. No one talked about that. He had earned that right. to be a good policeman. He had walked the beat and been useful. And he talked about how, getting to work with the neighborhoods and trying to tamp down the illegality so that everyone could live in peace. That was the goal of everyone. And so again, when he talks about this, he talked then also about how cities are actually now making it easier for criminals to get right back on the street. And again, all of this stuff is actually working against the notion. So again, when you start talking about these slogans, that's what I want to get to first. The slogans aren't going to be helpful. And defend the police, if it means, defend them at all costs, well, of course, that's not correct either. But police have a legitimate role in our lives, and our culture really is blessed with pretty good policing. And all the statistics that talk about violence and all those kinds of things are all way, way, way down from many years ago. And even the racial issues are way down. And there's studies on this. Heather McDonald has a book on the war on cops, and she brings all this to bear. And there's even been some other studies just recently where it shows the propensity of an unarmed African American versus an unarmed white person to be shot. It's actually the white guy that's probably going to get shot more than the black guy. And the people who produced those studies are now under attack because, their studies didn't say what they were supposed to say. The point with all this is rogue police are not being defended by anybody. And so even if you defend the police as defend them at all costs, well, of course you can't stand for that. But defund the police cannot be defended either because it basically violates some fundamental principles about what is needed in a sinful world like ours. So we're going to talk about some of these things. Some things we're going to have to reject outright because it defies biblical wisdom, common sense, and logic. But that doesn't mean we're going to come up with simplistic solutions to the contrary either. All right, so this whole discussion kind of exploded on us again in end of May with George Floyd's death by the guy sitting on his neck. But for all of those who've been in urban ministry for years, these issues, race and equal access, bad policy, criminality, single-parent homes, poor, choiceless education, and then singularly looking to the police to solve all this, and then having bad police get in the way of all that. Again, how do we limit criminality without violating law-abiding citizens' rights so that they can go about their business of working hard, raising their families, educating their children, and creating a peaceful environment? How do we ensure equal opportunity, equal access to equal education? Those are the kind of things. How do we do all that when we ourselves are 100% sinners? See, because that's the main issue. That there's an underlying fundamental principle that defund the police doesn't believe in. They don't believe that we are fundamentally flawed. They believe that our systems are fundamentally flawed. And so when you get to that perspective, you're going to have much different policies, but those policies are going to create outcomes. And you're not going to like the outcomes if you violate the fundamental truths that you have to deal with. I'm going to put on our website a book review on Thomas Sowell. It's called A Conflict of Visions. For those of you, I've talked about this before, but A Conflict of Visions, Sowell talks about, now he's not talking about from a Christian perspective, but if you're a Christian, you can kind of see where we would fall in this. He talks about a constrained vision of life, where we really can't solve all our problems because there's something broken about us, or an unconstrained vision of life. And that's kind of the utopianism that we see on display with so many people today that, they go to college, they get an education, and they're told that everything's systemic and there's unlimited potential with you, and the only thing that's holding us back is these bad systems, so destroy the systems. And then something beautiful and utopian will come up in its place. Why? Because we are by nature good people, and we would never do anything but what's best for ourselves and for others. Well, that's so naive, I can't even stand it when you start to think about what the history even and sociology and psychology actually teaches us. In fact, there was another article that hit right this morning. It had nothing to do with race or policing, but it's about 3 guys that I guess went fishing in Florida, and I guess they were brutally murdered. And I just read that they caught the guys that did it. It was two guys, and it's not a racial thing at all. Two guys and a gal. This one guy, they said, was a brutal criminal, and he killed them like they meant nothing to him. And I, from what little I was able to read before I came on with our live today, it was all over whether or not the one of the fishermen guys would give them their truck. And because he wouldn't give them their truck, they brutally murdered all three guys. What are you going to do? Are you going to send in a social worker to deal with that kind of brutality? You know, there are certain people in this world, we're all 100% sinners, but there are certain people who act it in everything they do, and they're unconstrained by any conscience. What will you do? And the police, the job of the police is to deal right there and say, society says this far and no further. You know, moms and dads couldn't stop them. Schools couldn't stop them. Social workers couldn't stop them. They're coming, and the police say, no, you're stopping right here. And there's a legitimate role that they have to play in our lives, because that's a real part of our humanity. It's a real part of our anthropology. And so, you know, again, I've read another, you know, Defund the Police article, and they basically said they wanted to defund it all and give it all to social workers and folks like that. And I just said, and we're going to talk about an article where a woman actually tried to go reason with somebody and tried to do exactly what the kind of social worker mentality would say, and she was shot 8 times. There are certain people you cannot reason with, and that's why legitimately we have a role for police in our lives. Our view is that you should limit the role of the police in your life. So we're okay with people saying rogue cops are a problem. But if you limit, then you have to then, again, what we talked about before, you have to have something that takes its place so that you don't really need that kind of policing in your neighborhood. So again, fundamental teaching, is it the structure or is it the people? And it's not that the structures don't have problems if the people are sinful, but it's not either or. And the real issue is rogue things, especially when the structures are making good changes and are actually becoming, they're becoming honorable. We have probably one of the best police forces, if you will, in the world. If you've been in other culture and other countries and seen how the police actually function, in our country they're supposed to honor the rules and regulations we all say are right. And then we limit them to that level of involvement in our lives. You don't see that in other places, that's for sure. And the last thing we want is renegade neighborhoods with renegade police forces. That's what the KKK was. It was a renegade police force of some renegades who did not want to see the civil rights for all after the Civil War. So, you know, again, we've experienced the downside of that too. Why would we want to bring that back even more? Okay, so at its core, this is what Thomas Sowell says. You got two visions of life, but one is true. And the brokenness of humanity, that's the biblical worldview, that's the Founding Fathers' worldview. That's why they both limited the government's tyranny from the federal side and also limited the government's tyranny from the ultra-democratic side. They limited both of those sides so that you could actually live a life of virtue for the sake of your family. All right, so if that's the case, we have a broken world, and that's the case, we've got issues that we need to deal with. How do we engage? Again, 3 Bible verses that should always be on the tip of your tongue. Matthew 22, where Jesus deals with the tax issue and Caesar issue, and he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And even there, he's not saying that Caesar has total control of that, but God the Father gives Caesar a role in our lives, and then give to God what is God's, and God's unique role in and through the church. And so it is Jesus who differentiates those things. Caesar issues are never going to be total solutions. They're always going to be trade-off types of things, because they're broken. They're leaders who are broken, coming up with rules that are run by broken people to solve issues that we can't solve on our own. So you're always going to have temporal justice, relative peace, and there's always going to be trade-offs to it. And that's why it's tough. Politics is the basement floor of life for us. We don't think of it as, you know, if you talk about two kingdoms, you talk about church and state, Lutherans think of the work of the state as necessary, but it's like it's the basement floor. And living life is something that God wants for us to do by grace through faith in His Son. So think of it that way, as up and down. And there are people today who think government's on the top. We fundamentally disagree with that. Then Romans 13, and this is one we're going to have to talk about today. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. Now he goes on to say, consequently, whoever rebels against authority, legitimate authority, is rebelling against what God has instituted. And then he says, now the point of these rulers, rulers hold no terror for those who do what's right, but for those who do what's wrong. That's one of the problems today. Law-abiding citizens are fearful and criminals are not. That's something that's got to change, because that's not even in the spirit of how we organize ourselves in rule of law. That's not even what we want our police to be about. And then it talks about, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. If you do wrong, be afraid, for they bear the sword for a reason. So, again, the whole point is that the terror should be on those who are trying to do what is wrong. And the honor should be on those who are trying to do what is right. And fundamentally, that's what the role of government is. And the Founding Fathers talked about undergirding our God-given rights. That's their main purpose. And the rest of it is to just be referees to make sure that we have rule of law for everybody the same, so that we all can learn how to get along with one another. And people are looking more and more to the government to not only define the laws, but to tell us the rule of the game, and then to even play the game for us and just give us little goodies from their largesse. That's just not how we think about things. And then, of course, First Peter, it talks about honoring the governors who are sent by God to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right, for that is God's will. So again, and then it even tells us to honor the emperor, and that's part of our theme verse for the LCRL. I'll have that posted again, the theme verse, and some biblical explanations. But you get this notion of honor. Well, how do you honor something that is coercive, that is powerful? You honor it, and then our culture limits it at the same time. And those two things are very, very helpful. One of the biggest problems I see out there today is the dishonoring of it. Just vitriolic dishonor when none is deserved. And again, for those of you who are law enforcement in my audience, and I know I've got family, I've got friends, and I've got a lot of you who are just followers, we know how hard your job is. The problem is you're being asked to do something that you really aren't supposed to have to do. And so there is a sense where we need to actually say to our law enforcement, this is what we need from you, and to limit that to that, and then to take more responsibility for ourselves to do what needs to be done. So, basically then, from a biblical point of view, the government's healthy role is to curb evildoers, and a positive way of saying this would be to undergird our God-given rights, as the Constitution kind of frames it, and commend those who do good, and then promote that. And let us strive for that virtuously for the sake of others. Law and order is the same for all. The fact that this is again being used as some kind of like shibboleth for racism, law and order, the notion of equal punishment fits the crime, that we should be striving for that in a way that again, maybe in the past we didn't live up to it, but the notion itself is what can hold us together, because it's saying the rules of equal access needs to be honored by all people the same. And that's kind of what we're struggling with. When we get to the point where we deal with our past and we didn't live up to our past, there's a sense where if people have equal access and we provide those opportunities all the same, then let people live their lives freely. So law and order is the same for all. Honor and limit those coercive powers of government in our lives, and then assume control and discipline your own life to access these opportunities for yourself and for your family. So there are three kind of mom and pop papers that were written about these kinds of issues, and I'm going to again post those on our website so you can read them more in depth. But the first one is called Vocational Respect: Seeking Justice. So again, and that is, we first start with the fourth commandment: honor your father and your mother. The basic component of a healthy society is the family: father, mother, child. And when the culture's at war against father, mother, child, you're going to have problems. We have problems because of that. And actually, that is the main problem. And no one's talking about it, because the sexual libertine movement has decided the family is something to dispense with. And when you see BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, when you see them state that they want to destroy the nuclear family, and that is a white kind of supremacist thing, that's just silly. Family is foundational. Nuclear family, whether it's 2.3 kids or anything like that, we never defined that in America. We had large families in our families back in the day, back in the 100 years ago. We had a lot more families because we were more of a rural agricultural country than we were an urban country today. Large families, small families, no, family. That's the key. But again, when you start to then honor your father and your mother, that honoring moves out, and it moves out to teachers, it moves out to government officials, to law enforcement, it moves out. And so dishonoring is not part of how we engage any of this stuff. And the minute we see dishonoring and destruction, I saw an article where, again, staffers for major campaigns are calling cops worse than pigs, and they're calling them all these different names. Some are calling for them to be shot and all this kind of stuff. No, it's just fundamentally wrong. And chaos will not. That kind of chaos will not replace the healthy role of police. It'll only make things a lot worse. Okay. And we see this dishonoring not just towards the police. We're starting to see it now. There's an article from Miami where the Jesus statue has been, I think it was decapitated. A lot of Mary statues are now being violated and these kind of things. This is a dishonoring move in our culture, and we all should stand against that. And the Archdiocese of Miami wants it investigated as a hate crime. Well, of course, why shouldn't it be? If we're going to have these things called hate crimes, which I still think is a kind of nefarious way to do it, because then you're saying your motivations. If you killed somebody but you really hated him, or you killed somebody because you just didn't care anything about him, no, that you still killed somebody. The punishment should fit the crime. But if we're going to start doing these hate crimes, well, this has got to be one, and it stands against law-abiding citizens, the religious people. It's mostly from what I understood, is even in a Hispanic neighborhood. This should be a hate crime in every way, shape, or form. But it doesn't seem to be getting a whole lot of press. So vocational respect. So when we engage authorities, then the legitimate, legally established authorities need to be consented to, if you will, and honored. That doesn't mean that we don't hold them accountable, and it doesn't mean we do whatever we're told. But even when we defy, if you will, those legally authorities, and remember we talked about this, Christian disobedience always has to be about obedience and honoring, not about just rabid disobedience. We're willing to suffer the consequences at a point like that. So again, we should, even if we're going to challenge or limit legal authority in our lives, we should do that legally, and there's a process to do that in our culture as well. Like I said, we just had big protest here, and it was just outside of Mitch McConnell's place. I tried to get some footage of it, but it was really loud, and for whatever reason, my iPhones are just not working. I don't know what's going on with them. In fact, we're using a new one right now to tape this. I hope it's going well. But again, the point is they kind of took over our neighborhood, and I know this. I know this is one of those things that people say, well, don't make a fuss over it. But it just literally dominated our neighborhood for about an hour and a half, and then they were gone. And I'm like, why do you have the right to come into my neighborhood and put something on 150 decibels and just basically all things stop? I wouldn't do that in your neighborhood. Now, if I protested, I'd be peaceful and I'd be honoring and law-abiding. That's what we do. These are the kind of things we need to kind of have a conversation about, even as we're talking about really difficult issues. The second one, it's a broken world. This is one that's called, it's a broken world, no utopianism allowed. We've got to come to grips with this, folks. Our kids are being taught a lie in school. They're being taught that humanity is a tabula rasa, that we're basically sinless people. There is no such thing as sin. Everything is, everything is systemic, and if we would just get rid of the bad systems, peace and harmony and joy and love and peace would ensue. And it's a lie. And people are being used. They're actually being sent out rabidly to promote this. They don't understand when the tyranny finally comes, they'll be the first people to be subjugated. And so you look at this and you go, no, Jesus says it, in this world you will have trouble because it's a sinful, broken world. Take heart, I have overcome the world. So the only ultimate solutions are going to have to be in God's work in the world for all people. And that's a by grace through faith, uncoerced gift to all of you listening to me. And that can never be taken away from you once you have it. I mean, this world can't take it anyway. But again, when we look at this, this is a broken world, it's a sinful place. And so whatever you do, if you're going to talk about what you and I can do in our own sinfulness to try to make this sinful world less of an evil, destructive place, you're going to have to come to grips with the fact that you're always going to be dealing with sinful people no matter what. Whatever policy or temporal solution you put forth is always going to have side effects and trade-offs, and you try to mitigate those things as much as you possibly can. And here's the one that you just got: if you demand a perfect solution, you're going to wind up getting the worst solutions of all. Because the demand for perfect solutions is always the enemy of a good solution. And when it comes to the issues we're talking about today, there are good solutions out there, but there's still going to be problems with that. There's still going to be criminality, even if we've got healthy neighborhoods. There's still going to be rogue cops, even if we've got a great police force. There's always going to be those kinds of ghosts in the machine kind of thing. But you strive for a better or a good solution. But if you demand a perfect solution in all these things, you're going to be the one that ushers in tyranny for us all. And that has happened in history time and time and time again. Again, we talked about the French Revolution last week. That was this: we're going to make a perfect world. Science, technology, reason, rationality. We don't need the myths of religion, etc., etc. And the guillotines weren't far behind. So no utopianism when we actually deal with these tough issues. And then finally, honor your local sheriff. This is what I wrote. And support your local families. So when I look at these kinds of things, these are the kind of things that we're going to have to, the sheriff's there for a reason, but he doesn't take the place of the family. And if the family's broken down, then we got a real problem, and the sheriff can't really stop that either. These are the kind of issues we're going to have to delve into because we have put ourselves in this position after bad policies for the last 55 years. And those are the kind of things, if you want to have a healthy discussion about this, you're going to have to get into those weeds, okay? A healthy society can be traced back to healthy families, healthy children, strong moms and dads in the home, and as a last resort of someone who's basically going to be violent no matter what, then we have the police there for their legitimate but limited role in our lives. So law and order. So what I did is I took the approved language of the NBA protest language, and I just looked at some of these things. And I said, if you're going to do a bumper sticker, then we need to be able to have a dialogue about what you actually mean by that, and then by what your solutions are. And of course, they're going to start it up in the next week. And I'm an NBA fan. I go way, way, way back on this. I used to watch the NBA back in the day when it was tape delayed. I used to even know what the outcome of the game was, and I'd still watch it at 11:30 at night. Dr. J was always my hero. Just an incredible guy of class, and at the same time, he brought soul back to the NBA. He brought dignity back, to sports. He was just, I don't know, I'm sure he had a lot of pressure. I'm sure he put up with a lot of nonsense. But man, he was an idol to a lot of us, even before Larry Bird and Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan and all those guys. So again, I've always been a fan of this, but we're politicizing sports to such a degree, but we're not allowing for the discussion then. So if you're going to say Black Lives Matter, I want to know, are you talking about the police issue that's particular to the issue that happened to George Floyd, or are you talking about the socialist issue and the Marxist issue about undermining our old culture? Which one are you talking about? Because Marxism, by the way, is racist too, to its core. And yet there's Black Lives Matter leaders who are Marxists, and I don't understand that. That's like, how can you be a Planned Parenthood supporter if you're an African American because they want to? Their goal was to wipe you guys out. Why would you do that? So again, if you're going to wear that, I want to know what the discussion is at that as well. Vote, okay, but what do you mean by that? Vote for people who will empower you, or vote for people who will patronize and then later control you. Which one? Power to the people. Yeah, that's what a limited republic is all about, and there aren't very many of them in the world. In fact, there's only one. So I love this one. Love us. There was a whole bunch of these. Respect us, love us, listen to us, etc., etc. The government will never love you. The minute you're looking to the government for love, that is a fundamental problem. And so again, when you start thinking of public policy and politicians, I don't look for them to love me. I just say, make sure that the rules of the game are fair for everybody, equal access for everybody, educational choice for everybody, and then, get out of our way and we'll solve these problems for ourselves. And the last thing I'm going to worry about is whether you care for me or not, because very few politicians do. I am a man. Well, that entails being a father, being a husband, being a leader, as well as being honored in the society in which we live. And that is one of the big issues in the urban community. Where are the dads? And again, we created this. So I'm all about systemic change here. But again, that's got to be part of the problem, and that's never discussed in any of these issues. I don't even know what group economics means. Well, I do. But, what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Education reform, I'm all for it. In fact, no more money, educational choice. You'll see a radical change. You will see teachers starting to really care about students' education, and well, the teachers do. I'm not ragging on public school teachers in general, because most of them just want to be good teachers. But you will see the unions get out of the way, because teachers want to educate kids, and parochial teachers and private teachers want to do that. And as long as the parent can take it wherever he wants, you'll see a lot of systemic change happen overnight. And by the way, if we're going to defund police, then let's defund all these things, because all these things are participating supposedly in the systemic problems. And then mentors, fathers, mothers, grandparents, aunts, and uncles. So those are kind of things I'd love to have discussions about that. If we're going to put that out there, let's really talk about some of these issues going forward. And by the way, the fatherlessness stuff, again, I don't want to pick on the NBA here, but there is a real systemic problem in the NBA with dads in the homes. I was reading an article, Len Elmore, he's an ESPN broadcaster, he used to be an agent, and he said, I got out of it because I was dealing with paternity suits more. He said, there's probably an illegitimate child for every basketball player in the NBA, and if one guy doesn't have any, another guy's got 2, 3, or 4. That's a problem. To talk about the kind of violence and poverty and the things that are happening in the urban communities. Fatherlessness is the main reason. And now there's 80% in the black community, I think it's 60% in the Hispanic community, and 50% in the Anglo community. These are things we've got to deal with, because kids need to be disciplined by their families, especially their dads. And again, you can't send in a policeman to do that job. The social work kind of idea of sending in the social worker, I remember when I was a pastor, I made a mistake where I didn't let the police do their job. I went in too early. We had a parishioner who called and said, my husband has a gun. He wants to kill himself. Will you come help? And of course, like Superman pastor, I ran to the house, and walked in, and I stood outside the door and I talked him out. Then I got home and my wife said, you ever do that again, I'll kill you myself. Why? Because the first thing should have been sending the police to get the gun out of his hand. Okay, that should have been the first thing. He hadn't done anything criminal. It was in the house, but they know how to deal with that kind of stuff. And if he gets violent, they can deal with that. I stood outside that door, and if he decided to just, end it all, he could have taken me out. It was foolish of me to think that I could do their job. So let them do their job, and then come in and do the kind of job that only Christ and His Word can do through the pastoral ministry. So again, these are issues, and the libertinism of our culture, it's destroying us, and this is in every one of our communities, black, white, Hispanic, we've got to deal with this stuff. You know, when I heard that at the Olympics, that one of the Olympic Village was more like Caligula's Rome than it was like Newt Rockney's All-American movie, you know. I thought, what have we become when that is what you can't wait to do? Win, lose, or draw. So, honor and limit. And in America, you have the role. If you're going to get involved in this discussion about what is a police role in our lives, great. But you also then got to talk about, if you're going to talk about police brutality, you got to talk about criminality, you got to talk about the actual, what is actually happening on the streets. They asked some people how many unarmed black people are shot every year, and people were saying 1,400, 1,500. It's 10, 15 people a year, and there's more unarmed white people that are shot every year. It's still a problem, and there are problems in these issues, and there's even problems with some of the policing protocols in some of these places. Get involved, but you're going to have to get involved in all these discussions, because the root of these problems is that without dads in the homes, police cannot solve the problem. So, we can't be sending unarmed civilians in where only police need to go. And that was this, I read this article about a gal that was sent in, she was told by her alderman, I believe it was, or her neighborhood politician, don't call the police, on some of these rogue kids, you go and try to reason with them. And it was about fireworks, and, they were just loud, scaring people at all hours of the night. Well, this woman actually went and tried to discuss that issue with one of the guys, the neighborhood guys, who was doing it, and he wound up chasing her down and shot her 8 times, and she's dead. And so there are some things that legitimately we've got to let our churches understand that there's a legitimate role of these authorities in our life. We have to teach our people how to honor them, even as we teach our people how to properly engage the limiting of their role in our lives. And then we have to rise to the level of virtuous living so that we really don't need them to do that. So assume control and discipline of your own life. That's the final thing after honor and limit. Support committed, lift up families in your neighborhood. Churches, you can do that. You can do that right now. You can try to help people solidify family units in your church programs. Educational choice, that's a policy issue that you can, and if people get a good education, they have choice in education, they actually make better decisions for themselves, and it begins to tamp down illegality in our neighborhoods as well. And then finally, have kids get schooling that undergirds those kind of values in their lives, and those are all good things. I talked about a manifesto. I know we're out of time here, but I do want to read this. It's still a work in process, but I do think we have to have an engagement mentality, because we really do. We care about our neighborhoods. We care about our neighbors, and I've lived in many different kinds of neighborhoods in my time in ministry, sometimes where being an Anglo, being a Caucasian was, I was definitely a minority in the neighborhoods, and I had very close friends in all the neighborhoods I've lived in, because there are certain things that transcend our ethnicity or even our socioeconomic position in life. And those things, the mannishness and the womanishness of mankind, or the humanity of human beings, because we're created in God's image, those allow us to bridge and to care for people that are even radically different than us in a lot of ways. So we need to have an engagement kind of strategy, and that's what Two Kingdoms is all about. So I said it this way: we have been set free to live freely, and we know that in all of the blessings we've received, they're to be put in service to sharing the good news of Jesus for all. So we will stand up for those experiencing injustice, but we will not destroy what we've already been given. We will stand up for the church's moral voice, and we will not look to government or politics to solve our deepest yearnings in life. We will stand up for family, the civic trinity for peace, as the first line of defense against the cultural plagues of violence, poverty, and amorality that beset us. We will stand up for educational freedom to push back against the nihilistic darkness of the social sexual libertinism that now plagues our schools, our universities, our politics, and our culture. We will stand up for a person's individual dignity and their right and responsibility to live a virtuous life for those they love and serve. And so we will stand up for necessary but limited government. We'll honor that. A necessary but limited police force, and the freedom to educate our own, the freedom to build the sanctuary of our homes, the freedom to engage in the enterprise to care for our families, and the freedom to build our neighborhoods out without government coercion or fear, using the nefarious forces of government only when it's absolutely necessary. And we will stand up for the notion that it's right and salutary to fight for temporal freedoms in culture, especially one that gives us First Amendment civic responsibilities to that end, even as we ultimately serve and turn the other cheek in service to our neighbor for the sake of the gospel. Those are, I'm calling that my Two Kingdom Manifesto of healthy citizenship. Not publishing it yet because I'm still thinking it through, but you can kind of see the spirit that's there, and I hope that's a spirit that enamors you and motivates you, because we do need people to stand up and engage the culture for the sake of the culture and for the sake of the church. So thanks for the emails. Keep sharing, keep praying, and please, if you're able to support us, if you can go on our website. You can mail it in. There's a P.O. box there. We're having some folks in St. Louis still process our checks, but even we're here in D.C., or you can do that online. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your support. Keep sharing these things with others. But always, until we see each other, until face to face, or until we see Jesus face to face, speak the truth in love with humility and grace. Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Until next time, God richly bless you. Thanks for being with us today. Bye-bye.